There was a woman in my kayak. That would have been fine, except she was wearing a wine-soaked robe, holding a half-eaten cheese board, and screaming about maritime rights, while clumsily paddling away from my dock with my dog still sitting on the end of it, stunned. I hadn't even turned off my truck yet. This wasn't some lakeside prank. It was the beginning of a suburban meltdown starring Karen, the new HOA president, and it all began the moment she decided my private dock should belong to the entire community. My dock isn't just a few planks of wood nailed together, it's the lifeline of my coastal home. I bought the property before the HOA ever existed, and I've kept it pristine. While most people in the neighborhood host backyard BBQs or argue over fence paint, I lease my dock to the Coast Guard for drills, emergency fuel stops, and the occasional high-speed maneuver that rattles every boat parked nearby. It's federally documented and untouchable by local HOA rules. At least, that's what I thought. Until Karen showed up. She moved in 2 months ago, a recent divorcee with a dog named Basil, a voice that could shatter glass, and a laminated HOA rulebook she treated like scripture. Her first HOA meeting included a PowerPoint titled, "How to Improve Our Community by Removing Individualism," which, as you can imagine, didn't go over well with anyone who enjoys owning property. Still, she somehow became president, possibly because no one else wanted to do the job, or possibly because she threatened to reassign pool access to those who didn't vote for her. Either way, she took her new power seriously. Very seriously. It started with a note, handwritten, taped to my mailbox, and covered in glitter for reasons I'll never understand. "Dear homeowner," it read, "the HOA has noticed your dock appears to be underutilized and inaccessible to the community. We'd love to schedule a discussion about making it available for neighborhood event. Let's work together to make the coast a shared space." I blinked, then blinked again, then laughed. I figured it was just a harmless overreach. I replied with a typed letter, attaching the lease agreement with the Coast Guard, city zoning permissions, and a copy of the deed showing the dock belonged to me, not the HOA. I even highlighted the part where it said, "This structure is not subject to future community governance." Karen responded with a note that simply said, "We'll see." I didn't think much of it, until I returned home from a weekend away to find plastic wine cups all over my dock, a cooler full of half-melted brie, someone's forgotten sandals on my boat cover, and a yoga mat wrapped around my anchor line like a sea serpent. My dog, Tank, a lazy but loyal German shepherd, sat beside it all with a look that said, "You won't believe what they did." Apparently, while I was gone, Karen hosted a dockside detox event with 10 of her closest friends. She claimed the dock was common access space, and that she'd temporarily liberated it from private misuse. There was even a sign hung on my fence in dollar store lettering, "Community Dock, Namaste and Chardonnay." It would have been hilarious if it weren't real. I called her that evening, politely but firmly explaining the legal situation and that the Coast Guard would be arriving the next day. I told her not to access the dock again and asked her to inform her guests to stay away from any federally leased space. She responded with a condescending laugh and said, "What Coast Guard? You mean those guys in the cosplay uniforms? I thought they were playing paintball." The next morning, I woke up early and went to the dock to prep for the incoming patrol boat. That's when I saw the real insult. Karen had set up lawn chairs again. Empty now, but clearly used. She'd also moved one of the fuel drums closer to the edge, apparently thinking it was in the way. That's not just entitled, that's dangerous. One spark, and she would have blown herself into HOA history as the first president to cause a dock fire using rose and reckless arrogance. I called my contact at the Coast Guard, Officer Ramsey, and explained the situation. His response was simple: "Send me the footage. If she interferes again, we'll handle it." I had security cameras set up around the property, mostly to keep track of raccoons and the occasional lost tourist, but now they were proving very useful. I sent over footage of the wine party and her dragging patio furniture across my boat like she was staging a magazine shoot for HOA Weekly. Later that day, I watched from the deck as the Coast Guard boat pulled up, 3 officers in full gear stepping onto the dock. They were professional, polite, and precise. Karen, however, was none of those things. She arrived moments later with a whistle, clipboard, and the unfortunate confidence of someone who thinks YouTube is a law degree. She demanded they present maritime proof of community docking permissions, whatever that meant. When they calmly explained who they were and what the dock was used for, she said, and I quote, "You people can't just claim a whole dock for yourselves like pirates." Officer Ramsey asked her if she understood the meaning of federal jurisdiction. She said she'd have to check with the board. Then, she actually tried to block the boat from leaving, standing in front of it and waving her clipboard like a traffic cop. It was the most surreal thing I've ever seen, and I've worked through hurricane evacuations. Eventually, the officers had enough. They warned her she was interfering with a federal operation and that she needed to leave immediately. She left, grumbling about making a citizen's arrest and muttering something about a dock revolution. I couldn't believe it. Most people, when confronted with federal law enforcement, back down. Karen? She was just getting warmed up. That night, she sent out a community newsletter titled, "A Dock Divided Cannot Float." It claimed I was using military threats to suppress community access, and that she would be launching a petition to reclaim the space for public use. The kicker? She included a picture of herself on my kayak from earlier, waving like she was on a cruise. I checked the caption, "Karen, reclaiming the waters for the people." I stood there with the letter in one hand, leash in the other, while Tank stared up at me like he was waiting for me to throw it so he could destroy it. My phone buzzed. It was Officer Ramsey. "She blocked our access again this afternoon. We'll be escalating this." That's when I realized, this wasn't just about a dock anymore. This was war. The following Monday, a bright orange flyer appeared on my door, flapping in the sea breeze like a warning flag. At the top, in Comic Sans of all things, it read, "Community Dock Liberation Initiative." Below that was a bullet-pointed list of grievances. Unfair private ownership, lack of community input, militarized water usage, and the real kicker, non-inclusive kayak etiquette. I don't even know what that last one meant, but apparently, it was enough to justify a neighborhood petition. By noon, I'd already been approached by 2 neighbors asking if I could open the dock for just a few family photos, and maybe a quick paddleboard launch. When I explained that it was under federal lease and not mine to share, one of them replied, "But Karen said it was just a formality and you're being dramatic." That was the moment I knew things were spiraling out of control. Karen had officially weaponized ignorance, and the neighborhood was swallowing it like ice cream on a hot day. She went door to door, clipboard in hand, with that smug HOA smile that made people either hide behind curtains or pretend to agree just to get her off their porch. And somehow, she collected over 30 signatures. I saw one guy sign it with his toddler's crayon just to make her leave. She didn't even care. She paraded the petition around the community like it was a declaration of independence. I received an email that evening from the HOA board, subject line, "Dock fine notification." According to their logic, because I was denying fair access to a water-based amenity, I owed $500 per day in community fees, retroactive to the date of their petition. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my sandwich into the marina. I didn't respond to the email. Instead, I forwarded it to Officer Ramsey and attached the petition with its glitter stickers and peace signs drawn in gel pen. His reply was curt, "Got it. Documenting. Let me know if she escalates." The funny thing about that was, she already had. The next morning, Karen stationed herself at the end of my driveway with a neon vest and a homemade sign that said, "Community Patrol." She waved at joggers, glared at my security cameras, and loudly warned dog walkers not to get too close to restricted federal zones. I'm not sure if she was mocking the Coast Guard or if she genuinely believed she'd become some kind of nautical sheriff, but either way, it was equal parts disturbing and hilarious. Then came the day the Coast Guard arrived for a refueling drill. As usual, 3 officers pulled up on a cutter, ready to run their checklists and test the temporary storage equipment I'd installed to their spec. The moment they docked, Karen marched down from the street, holding a bright blue lanyard like it was a badge and demanding to see community identification credentials. She insisted they were required to register with the HOA visitor log, wear wristbands for insurance purposes, and sign a waiver promising not to perform intimidating military acts. The officers, stunned at first, politely explained who they were, why they were there, and how the dock was leased for their use. Karen crossed her arms and said, "That lease doesn't override community guidelines. This isn't a military zone, it's a residential neighborhood. You're scaring the children." One of the officers blinked and replied, "Ma'am, with all due respect, you can't override federal jurisdiction with neighborhood feelings." That didn't sit well with her. She pulled out her phone and started filming them, narrating in a whisper like she was David Attenborough. Here we see the elusive government worker, confused, uncooperative, and possibly trespassing. She uploaded it to the neighborhood Facebook page, along with a caption accusing the Coast Guard of unauthorized watercraft deployment and fuel-related fear tactics. Comments were a mix of support, disbelief, and someone asking if she was drunk again. Officer Ramsey called me later that day. She blocked access, verbally harassed my crew, and tried to stop a fuel line check. That's not just annoying, that's obstruction. We're escalating. He didn't sound angry. He sounded focused, and that scared me more than if he'd been yelling. That evening, the HOA held an emergency board meeting. Karen insisted it be held at the community pool because, as she put it, water is the issue and the answer. She stood in front of a printed-out map of the neighborhood, where she had drawn little boats in the margins and circled my property in red. Her presentation was called Dock Equity, a vision for shared spaces. She explained how my refusal to open the dock was stifling neighborhood growth and creating division among maritime-minded residents. She even quoted Thoreau. I wasn't invited, but one of my neighbors texted me updates in real time. Apparently, Karen said that if the Coast Guard wanted to keep using the dock, they could apply for guest access privileges like everyone else. When someone asked if she had the legal authority to restrict federal operations, she responded with, "They haven't sued me yet, have they?" That was the moment the HOA vice president reportedly slid back in his chair and quietly Googled, "Can you get sued by the U.S. military?" To be clear, the rest of the HOA board wasn't thrilled about this direction. A few of them were visibly sweating through their polos. But no one stood up to her, at least not yet. That changed the next day when a new face rang my doorbell. I opened the door to find a tall, broad-shouldered man in a Hawaiian shirt and aviators. He extended a hand and said, "Name's Gary. Used to command the Coast Guard out of Charleston. Moved here last year. Just wanted to say I've seen this kind of behavior before, and I'm on your side." Turns out, Gary had already had a run-in with Karen when she told him his American flag was too large for a peaceful neighborhood. He'd laughed in her face and kept it flying. When I told him what was going on with the dock, he nodded and said, "Then it's time she meets the right kind of pressure. Let's coordinate." I didn't know what that meant yet, but I liked the sound of it. Meanwhile, Karen was busy planning her next move. She'd posted a new poll online. Should we turn the dock into a community boat club? The options were yes, absolutely, and only if wine is served. I'd seen a lot in my time near the water. Storms, shipwrecks, even a floating wedding where the bride fell in. But nothing had prepared me for HOA warfare. And Karen wasn't just fighting for access to a dock. She was fighting for dominance, for control, for the delusional fantasy that rules didn't apply to her. But what she didn't know was that the Coast Guard was about to drop anchor, legally and literally, right on top of her plans. Karen was quiet for 3 whole days. That should have been my first warning. Because when someone like her goes silent, they're not giving up, they're plotting. And sure enough, on the 4th night, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the doc cam. I checked the footage, and there she was, wearing all black like she was auditioning for a low-budget spy movie, tiptoeing down the boardwalk with a flashlight in one hand and a tape measure in the other. For a moment I thought she was just inspecting the planks, but then she crouched next to the fuel storage drum, pulled out a phone, and started taking photos from every angle like she was collecting evidence. She slipped on a slick patch of algae, fell straight into the shallow end with a splash, then scrambled out like a soggy raccoon, shaking her arms and yelling "Gross!" to herself. That would have been the end of it, except she called the police. I didn't know about it until I heard knocking at my door just before sunrise. 2 local officers, tired eyes and coffee breath, stood on my porch. One held a notepad, the other had already seen the footage I sent earlier from my phone. "Sir," one of them said, "we received a complaint about an assault. A woman claims she was pushed into the water by a dock occupant." I blinked at him and gestured toward the security camera. "You mean when she trespassed and lost a fight with gravity?" They exchanged a glance. "Yeah, that's what the footage shows too. But she's insistent." Apparently, Karen claimed I had hired Coast Guard thugs to intimidate her and that I ambushed her with marine hazards. It was so ridiculous that even the officers couldn't keep a straight face. One of them muttered, "First time we've heard someone say algae is a security system." They left without pressing charges, though I could tell they were getting tired of being dragged into HOA drama. A few hours later, I got a call from Officer Ramsey, who had also seen the footage. He didn't sound amused. "She's escalating, and now she's interfering with inspections. That crosses a line." I asked what that meant in Coast Guard terms. "It means we're done playing nice." That afternoon, I returned from town to find my fence covered in handmade signs. Karen had apparently recruited some local kids to help her put them up. Crayon drawings, glitter letters, and one truly horrifying marker rendering of me as a pirate with a parrot made of tax bills. The main one read, "Community only beyond this point," right on my private gate. She'd also taped a letter to my door, marked HOA Mandate, stating that if I continued to deny public access to shared resources, I'd be subject to property reassignment hearings. I didn't even know what that meant. Probably because it wasn't real. But it didn't stop her from sending the same letter to every house in the neighborhood. Later that day, Gary, the retired Coast Guard captain, called to check in. I filled him in, and he let out a long, theatrical sigh. She thinks she can outmaneuver the federal government with construction paper and delusion. He paused. Time for a little pressure from the top. I didn't ask what that meant. I just sat back and waited. The following morning, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into my driveway. A woman stepped out, wearing a navy blazer with a Coast Guard badge pinned to the lapel. Behind her came 2 uniformed officers. They weren't there to play tour guide. They carried clipboards, measuring equipment, and stern expressions. Karen, ever the opportunist, arrived mid-inspection, marching down the sidewalk in her tennis outfit like she was headed for a match with destiny. "Excuse me," she called out. "This is not approved. You're in violation of our HOA inspection protocol." One of the officers calmly turned to her. "Ma'am, we're with the United States Coast Guard. This property is under federal lease. We're here to investigate unauthorized interference with government property." Karen, never one to read the room, replied, "I'm here to investigate interference with community harmony." She pointed at the woman in the blazer. "Who authorized this? I demand credentials." The officer handed her a badge. Karen squinted at it, frowned, then looked up and said, "Anyone can print a badge." That's when the SUV door opened again and another woman stepped out, tall, composed, carrying a small case. She introduced herself as a legal representative for the Coast Guard. Then she handed Karen a folder. Inside was a formal cease and desist order, citing obstruction of operations, trespassing, and interference with a federal training site. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I couldn't hear the rest of what was said, but by the time they walked away, Karen's face was pale and she was shaking her head like she'd just discovered gravity was real. She stormed off without another word. That night, she was unusually quiet. No next-door posts. No emails. No clipboard patrols. For a moment, I thought it was over. But I should have known better. The silence broke 2 days later when flyers appeared all over the neighborhood. Dynamic Dock Day, coming this Saturday. It had balloons, a wine list, a DJ lineup, and a full schedule of activities, all happening on my dock. I nearly spit out my coffee. She had actually scheduled a community event on private, federally leased property after being hit with a cease and desist. It wasn't ignorance anymore. It was delusion marinated in defiance. I showed the flyer to Gary, who took one look and laughed. Perfect. Let her throw her party. We'll bring the guests. I raised an eyebrow. What kind of guests? He grinned. The kind with uniforms and big boats. I didn't ask for details. I just cleared my schedule for Saturday. When the day arrived, it was everything Karen had promised. Tables, streamers, coolers of rose, and a DJ who kept yelling "yacht vibes only" into a mic. Dozens of residents showed up, most of them just looking for free wine. Karen stood at the entrance like a host at a private club, wearing a sash that said, Dock Queen, and handing out paper wristbands like she was managing Coachella. I stayed inside until the first boat engine roared. Then I stepped out onto the deck just as the first Coast Guard vessel rounded the bend, followed by 2 more. They weren't here for drills. They were here to make a statement. The lead boat parked beside the dock, crew stepping out with full formality, boots thudding against the boards as they cleared a space. Karen, confused but still clinging to her party, ran up with her sash flapping in the wind. "You're not on the guest list," she shouted. The officer in charge looked down at her, stone-faced. "We're not guests, ma'am. We're the reason this dock exists." Then, as if on cue, a second crew launched a water cannon demonstration that sent a misty blast over the wine table, toppling glasses and drenching the DJ equipment. The music died with a loud electronic gasp, and the DJ scrambled to unplug his gear. Guests ran for cover. Karen stood frozen, soaked and seething, mascara dripping like war paint. I leaned on the railing and sipped my coffee, watching it all unfold like live theater. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I knew the tide had turned. Karen had declared war. But she'd just learned what happens when you pick a fight with the Coast Guard. Karen's big event was a spectacular disaster. The flyers said it was Dock Day for the people, but by the time the Coast Guard was done making their point, it looked more like the aftermath of a soggy pirate mutiny. The DJ's speakers had shorted out, leaving him muttering about how he doesn't do military ops, and the wine-tasting tent was now more of a grape-scented tarp graveyard. Guests who came for sips and sun had scattered in every direction, most of them clutching their sandals and paper plates of ruined charcuterie. But Karen? Karen stayed behind. Dripping wet, mascara running down her cheeks, clutching a clipboard that now resembled soggy cardboard, she just stood there. It was like the moment she realized she wasn't the main character anymore, just a wet extra in someone else's movie. But if you thought that would stop her, you don't understand Karen. The very next morning, she was back on the HOA message board claiming the Coast Guard had terrorized a peaceful community event, and that military intimidation tactics had no place in neighborhood waters. She even demanded an emergency vote to reclaim and reassign my dock to the HOA for better stewardship. She framed it as a safety issue, citing slippery planks, aggressive uniforms, and what she called propulsion trauma caused by the boat engines disrupting her guests' energy fields. She didn't just double down. She built a whole casino on that nonsense. Now, normally the HOA board tried to avoid public embarrassment, but with that many neighbors witnessing the maritime chaos, it was impossible to pretend it hadn't happened. One board member, Marcia, quietly called me to say they'd had a closed-door meeting the night before. Apparently, after watching the video of Karen yelling, "I am the doc," while waving a half-eaten baguette at a Coast Guard officer, the treasurer just got up and left. The board didn't have the spine to fire her outright, but they agreed that no further actions regarding the dock would be pursued. It was a quiet surrender, wrapped in the kind of vague language that HOAs love: pause on all aquatic resolutions pending legal review. I should have celebrated, but something told me Karen wasn't finished. Sure enough, 2 days later, a camera drone buzzed past my window and hovered over the dock. It circled slowly, scanning the area like it was doing a Zillow listing for the Navy. I followed it with my binoculars and spotted the operator. Karen, standing in her backyard in a wide-brimmed sun hat, holding a remote control like she was directing a surveillance op. I walked down to the dock, looked straight at the drone, and waved. It hovered for a second, then zipped away like it had just been caught cheating on a test. The next day, I got a letter in the mail. Not from Karen this time, but from her nephew. Yes, the same nephew who had just passed the bar exam and apparently fancied himself a cross between Atticus Finch and a traffic lawyer. The letter was printed on letterhead that looked suspiciously like a word template, complete with an eagle watermark and a misspelled slogan: "Justice where you dock." It accused me of harboring federally affiliated personnel in violation of local community ordinances, and demanded immediate cessation of militarized water rights. It also stated that if I didn't comply, legal action may be explored, though it never clarified what kind of action or by whom. I sent the letter to the Coast Guard legal team. Their response was short and beautiful: received. Frivolous. No further reply warranted unless action is taken. Still, I kept the letter. I was starting to build a nice little collection of Karen memorabilia. Between the cease and desist order, the wine-soaked dock day flyers, and now this amateur lawsuit threat, I could probably frame them and start a local museum. But then came the final straw. Karen didn't just want to reclaim the dock. She wanted to erase it. One morning, I woke up to find bright orange flags planted all around my property line, with spray-painted arrows pointing toward the dock and little plastic markers reading "Potential Development Zone." Confused, I followed them down to the water. There, taped to one of the railings, was a laminated document titled "Preliminary Expansion Plan, HOA Kayak Club." It included a hand-drawn map that showed my dock replaced by a floating clubhouse, complete with a juice bar and a community reflection nook. She'd even included doodles of people meditating next to a koi pond. On my dock, on federal lease property. I took the map to Gary, who stared at it in silence for a solid minute before bursting out laughing. "She's drawing fake buildings now? What's next? A hot tub submarine?" He reached into a drawer and pulled out a worn folder. I was waiting to use this. Inside was documentation from his time as Coast Guard commander, official blueprints, historical records, and a report on strategic coastal locations, including this very dock. He'd already contacted an old friend in D.C., and apparently, someone high up was very interested in a certain HOA interfering with emergency preparedness operations. Later that week, Karen received a letter marked with a shiny gold seal: Department of Homeland Security. It wasn't a threat. It was an official inquiry into whether the HOA had knowingly obstructed Coast Guard access to a federally authorized dock used for national emergency drills. And just like that, Karen went silent again. Not for 3 days. Not for a week. But completely. No flyers. No emails. No sashes. She didn't even show up for the monthly HOA meeting, which she had once insisted was her constitutional duty to the community. The board met without her. Quietly, discreetly, and unanimously, they passed a motion stating that no HOA policies would ever apply to my dock. They also removed Karen from all leadership roles, citing conduct detrimental to neighborhood harmony and national security interests. It was as close to an exile as you can get without being handed a canoe and a push. Word spread fast. Some neighbors came by to apologize, bringing cookies and awkward smiles. A few chuckled nervously and said things like, "Didn't know you were running a military base back here." And I just nodded and said, "Neither did Karen." One kid from down the street asked if the Coast Guard was going to build a submarine under my house. I told him I couldn't confirm or deny. Gary and I had a quiet drink on the dock that evening. The water was calm. No banners, no wine tables, no rogue yoga instructors chanting about community rights. Just the sound of the waves and a pair of Coast Guard boats floating nearby on standby. He raised his glass and said, "To peace, finally." I clinked my glass to his and replied, "At least until she finds a new hobby." But even as the sun dipped below the horizon and the last ripple faded from the water, I had the feeling we hadn't seen the last of Karen. Because someone like her doesn't just disappear. They regroup. They simmer. And somewhere, deep in the HOA bylaws, she was probably flipping pages, hunting for her next battleground. The peace that followed Karen's downfall was as unfamiliar as it was welcome. For weeks, the dock remained untouched except by those who belonged there, Coast Guard boats making their scheduled stops, a few seabirds claiming the rails, and me, sitting on the edge with my dog tank, coffee in hand, listening to the tide instead of chaos. It was the kind of quiet I hadn't known since Karen had declared war on my dock like it was the last hill in some suburban revolution. The HOA board kept their distance, clearly still shaken by the Homeland Security letter. And Karen? Vanished. No neighborhood patrols. No clipboard crusades. Not even a passive-aggressive flyer about the spiritual toxicity of federally influenced water. It was like she'd dissolved into the salty breeze. Then, one crisp morning, a letter arrived addressed to me, not from Karen, not even from the HOA, but from the office of the Regional Coast Guard Commander. It was a formal thank you. Apparently, the footage from Dock Day, along with all the reports I'd submitted, had sparked more than just online buzz. The incident had been used in a presentation about civilian interference and community coordination. The dock, as a result, was being given a permanent designation as an official Coast Guard emergency training site. That meant it was now locked into federal protection, permanently immune from any HOA action or neighborhood claim. It was like winning the lottery, except instead of cash, I got freedom from Karen. As if the universe wanted to seal the deal, a bronze plaque was installed on the side of the dock later that week. Simple, elegant, and deeply satisfying, it read, "This dock supports national safety and readiness. Maintained in cooperation with the United States Coast Guard. Unauthorized interference is a federal offense." I took a picture and considered printing it on t-shirts. But before I could even enjoy the full glow of vindication, the neighborhood grapevine began buzzing again. It started with whispers at the mailbox. Then a text from Marcia, "You're not going to believe this. She's back." Apparently, Karen had resurfaced at the HOA board meeting, not as a leader but as a very vocal audience member. She sat in the front row with a stack of binders labeled New Community Visions. According to Gary, who now served as an unofficial HOA whisperer, she declared her new purpose was redirecting community energy toward more balanced, less militarized spaces. No mention of the dock. At first, I ignored it. Let her focus on someone else's fence or start a campaign against garden gnomes. But trouble has a way of circling back, especially when it has a personal grudge and too much free time. One evening, I found a brand new yoga mat tied around my mailbox like a bow. Attached to it was a flyer, clean design, calming font. Karen's Community Center Proposal, a Vision for Unity. It listed a number of project ideas, but right at the bottom, in smaller print, was a familiar phrase. The original dock site would make a beautiful community meditation platform with minor modifications. Minor modifications, in Karen's speak, meant demolishing it and replacing it with wind chimes and bean-bag chairs. I called Gary, who nearly choked on his tea. "She doesn't learn, does she?" I told him I wasn't worried. After all, the federal designation was untouchable. Still, he suggested we post a copy of the lease and federal orders right at the entrance. Not for Karen, he said, but for the neighbors who might forget. So we did. A sleek new sign, sealed in glass, with everything from the Coast Guard contract to the Homeland Security letter posted neatly for all to read. No more confusion. No more excuses. That should have been the end of it. But then came the final twist. Karen's nephew, the amateur lawyer, resurfaced with a new strategy. Apparently deciding federal law was too big to challenge directly, he filed a complaint with the local zoning office accusing me of unauthorized commercial activity. His argument? That by leasing the dock to the Coast Guard, I was operating a business in a residential zone. It was desperate. It was absurd. But it got a hearing. I showed up to the hearing dressed like a guy who just wanted to be left alone. The zoning officer was polite but weary. Karen sat behind her nephew, arms crossed, eyes locked on me like I had sunk her battleship. Her nephew read a statement full of dramatic pauses and bizarre claims about military gentrification. I handed over the federal documentation and waited. The zoning officer flipped through it silently for a few minutes, then said the best sentence I'd heard all year. "This is out of our jurisdiction. Case dismissed." Karen stood up as if she was going to appeal right there in the room, but her nephew gently pulled her back down, whispering something that made her purse her lips so tightly they nearly disappeared. As I left, a reporter from the local paper asked me if I had a comment. I smiled and said, "I think the doc speaks for itself." That quote ran in the weekend edition, alongside a photo of the Coast Guard plaque and a cropped image of Karen in the background looking like she'd just bitten a lemon. Back at home, things finally, truly settled. Neighbors who once tiptoed past my house now waved and smiled. One even brought over a bottle of wine and joked, "No parties unless the Coast Guard's invited." I kept the bottle and said nothing. I wasn't holding a grudge. I was just prepared. Because the thing about people like Karen is, they never really go away. They just bide their time, waiting for the next rule to twist, the next hill to conquer, the next clipboard to fill. But for now, the water was calm. The dock stood strong. And Karen, for all her declarations, schemes, and soggy revolutions, had finally run out of territory to claim. Tank and I sat at the end of the dock as the sun dipped low, the sky painted with fire, the waves gently lapping at the pilings. No chants, no demands, no drama, just peace. Until the mail arrived the next day. Inside was a flyer for a new HOA committee, Color Harmony Council. At the bottom, in tiny print, it read, "Proposed ban on shades of blue deemed too aggressive." I looked at Tank. He looked at me. Here we go again.